As night falls and shadows begin to cover the world, there are stories that can only be heard in the stillness of the dark. Stories not for the faint of heart, stories of mysterious encounters, of things hidden in the shadows that we should never see. Prepare yourself, for what you are about to hear may make you shiver and wonder if you are truly safe. Story 1. The Creepy Delivery Night. Last fall, I had just turned 18 and started my first job at a small coffee shop in the outskirts of town. It was a quiet, family-owned cafe with only a few employees. I only got the job because my best friend worked there too. My role was to deliver orders to customers, but I only worked late at night because I had school during the day. Around my second week, I received a delivery order to a far-off address. That night was unusually quiet, with few orders coming in. Near 11 p.m., we got a call for one coffee and a pastry. My friend took the order, logged it, and handed it over to me. The address was about a 15-minute drive away. As I drove, the road became narrower and darker. Trees on both sides swayed under the moonlight, casting strange shadows. I noticed there weren't many houses around, just this narrow path leading to an old house hidden behind thick trees. When I arrived, I saw it was a 2-story wooden house, dark and rundown, but strangely, the yard was full of well-tended plants and flowers. I parked, grabbed the coffee and pastry, and walked up the creaky wooden steps to the door. A strange chill crept over me, but I shook it off, glancing back to see the dark forest looming behind me. I knocked gently on the door and waited. The silence was overwhelming until I heard footsteps from inside, heavy and deliberate, getting closer to the door. I clutched the coffee and pastry tightly, bracing myself, but the door never opened. After waiting a few seconds, I called out, "Hello, I'm the delivery person. I have your order here." No answer, just silence. The sense of unease grew, and I instinctively took a step back, preparing to leave. But just then, a faint light from the window beside the door revealed a shadowy figure standing still, watching me from the darkness inside. He was thin and tall, with hollow eyes that seemed vacant and lifeless. I froze for a moment before gathering the courage to turn and walk briskly back to my car. He didn't move, just stood there, watching me with an eerie stillness as if waiting for something. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped off. Looking in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, motionless in the dark, his gaze fixed on me, unblinking. When I got back to the cafe, I told my friend what happened. He laughed and suggested it might have been a prank, but something about the man's stare felt deeply wrong. After that, I refused to take any deliveries to that area. Story 2. The Late Shift. Stranger. It was early November, and I'd just started working part-time as a night janitor at an office building downtown. The pay was decent, and I liked the quiet since I was the only one there after hours. The building was 7 floors, but only the first 3 had offices. The rest were empty and closed off for renovation. One night, I arrived for my shift a little before midnight as usual. The streets were empty and the wind was howling, sending leaves skittering across the pavement. I went inside, clocked in and grabbed my cleaning supplies, mentally preparing for another night of dusting and vacuuming. Everything was routine, at least until I got to the 3rd floor. I'd been cleaning for about an hour when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a soft thud somewhere above me, like someone had dropped something heavy. My heart skipped a beat. No one should have been on the 4th floor. It was locked and completely empty due to construction. Trying to shake it off, I told myself it was just the building settling, or maybe some equipment had fallen over. I continued working, but my mind kept going back to that sound. A few minutes later, there it was again, a little louder this time. I could feel a chill running down my spine. Curiosity got the better of me, so I grabbed my flashlight and decided to take a quick look upstairs. I climbed the stairwell, the air feeling colder with each step, until I reached the locked door of the 4th floor. I shone my flashlight through the small glass window on the door, but didn't see anything unusual. I was about to head back down when I heard a faint whisper echoing from the other side of the door. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. Just as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something, a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway. My heart pounded as I squinted, trying to make out any details, but it was too shadowy. The figure didn't move, just stood there, completely still. Feeling my courage slipping, I backed away, turned, and hurried down the stairs, forcing myself not to look back. But as I reached the third floor, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps coming down the stairs behind me. I bolted down the hall, through the lobby, and out of the building, leaving my supplies behind. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block. The next day, I returned to retrieve my things, but I refused to go back up to the third floor alone. I asked my supervisor about it, but he just shrugged it off, saying no one was allowed on the upper floors and they were always locked at night. I never found out who or what was up there that night, but I know one thing: I never stayed late on that shift again. Story 3. The Silent Passenger. I was working as a rideshare driver in a mid-sized city last fall, mostly to make extra money on weekends. It was mid-November, and the nights were getting longer and colder. I usually picked up passengers near the downtown bars around closing time, and it wasn't unusual to get requests from people who'd had one drink too many. One Friday night, close to 2 a.m., I got a ride request from a spot just outside the city. It was a 15-minute drive to a quiet area, and I figured someone had gotten stranded. When I arrived, I saw a lone man standing by the curb, hunched over with his hands deep in his coat pockets, barely visible under the dim streetlight. As he got in the back seat, a chill immediately ran down my spine. He was silent, staring straight ahead, and didn't say a word, not even a hello. I tried to make small talk, but he only responded with a quiet, nearly inaudible grunt. I figured he was just tired or maybe had a rough night, so I left him alone. The GPS directed me down a winding road that I hadn't driven before. The area became increasingly desolate, with only occasional houses and dim streetlights. After a few minutes, I realized we were heading toward the outskirts, near the edge of a heavily forested area. As we drove, the silence in the car felt oppressive. I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, and each time I did, he seemed to be looking right at me, though his eyes were hidden in shadow. It was as if he could sense every glance. Finally, the GPS announced we'd arrived at the location, a dirt road leading into the woods. "Is this where you wanted to go?" I asked, forcing a casual tone. He didn't respond, just continued to stare blankly. I turned to look directly at him, and suddenly he leaned forward, his face barely visible in the dim light. His eyes were hollow, as if they were looking through me rather than at me. He whispered, almost too softly to hear, "Keep going." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. A wave of dread washed over me, and I felt an intense urge to turn around and leave, but I forced myself to keep driving down the narrow dirt path. My heart was pounding, and I could feel the tension in my chest tightening with every passing second. After what felt like an eternity, the dirt road ended at an abandoned, rundown cabin. "This is it," he said in the same eerie whisper. I turned around, but the back seat was empty. The passenger seat belt was still buckled, but he was gone. I sat there, frozen, staring at the empty seat, unable to comprehend what had just happened. I floored the gas pedal, racing out of those woods and back to the city as fast as I could. When I finally stopped at a gas station, I checked my app history. There was no record of that ride request. I never drove back to that area again, and to this day, I can't shake the feeling that someone or something is still out there waiting for another driver. Story 4: The Watcher in the Woods. Last October, my friends and I decided to go camping to enjoy the fall weather and the changing leaves. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any popular trails, to make sure we'd have privacy and quiet. It was just the four of us, and we planned to stay for 2 nights. The first day was perfect. We set up camp, gathered wood, and spent the evening around a campfire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. As night fell, the forest grew incredibly silent, with only the crackling of the fire breaking the stillness. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. Around midnight, as we were getting ready to sleep, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows just beyond the tree line. It was faint, like a silhouette, but as soon as I blinked, it was gone. I brushed it off as my eyes playing tricks on me and crawled into my tent. The next morning, my friend Mark mentioned that he felt like he was being watched during the night. The rest of us laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to freak us out, but something about his expression made me feel uneasy. I hadn't told him about the shadow I'd seen. That night, we all went to sleep a bit earlier. I woke up sometime in the early morning hours, hearing faint rustling noises outside my tent. I held my breath, straining to listen, and the sound grew closer, slow and deliberate. Heart pounding, I glanced toward the tent wall, and in the faint light, I could see a shadow moving. The figure stopped right outside my tent, and I could hear slow, steady breathing. I was paralyzed, too afraid to make a sound. The shadow lingered for what felt like forever, before slowly retreating into the woods. When dawn finally came, I stumbled out of my tent and saw that Mark and the others looked just as shaken. Mark told us he'd seen someone or something standing near the fire pit in the middle of the night, watching the tents. We all agreed it was time to pack up and leave immediately. As we hiked back to the car, we kept looking over our shoulders, feeling as though we were being followed. To this day, none of us know who or what was out there, watching us in the dark. Story 5: The Haunted Library Shift. Last November, I took a part-time job at the old public library in town. It was a huge, creaky building with dusty wooden floors and towering shelves. The library was mostly quiet, but every so often there were whispers around town about strange things happening there after dark. I thought it was just urban legend until I experienced it myself. My shift usually ended by 8 p.m., but one Friday, I volunteered to stay late to help with a new book inventory. Around 10 p.m., the head librarian locked up and left me alone to finish up. The silence felt heavier, more oppressive. The only sound was the echo of my footsteps down the empty aisles. At one point, I noticed a faint tapping sound coming from somewhere deep in the library. It started softly, almost like the rustling of pages, but then grew louder, as if someone was tapping rhythmically on one of the shelves. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was an old building and sounds like this were normal. But as I moved through the rows, I felt an uncomfortable prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I looked over my shoulder but saw nothing. Just endless rows of books, dimly lit under the library's old-fashioned lamps. I turned back to the inventory and continued counting. But then I heard it again. This time closer. It was a soft whisper, almost as if someone was speaking right behind me. "Are you looking for me?" I froze, my heart pounding, barely daring to breathe. Gathering my courage, I turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one there, just shadows cast by the flickering lights above. Suddenly, a cold breeze brushed past me, and the lights in the row flickered and went out. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it down the darkened aisle. In the faint beam, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a shadowy, translucent outline of a person standing at the end of the row, their face obscured. Without thinking, I bolted down the aisle, racing toward the exit. The tapping sound began again, louder, almost frantic, like footsteps chasing after me. I reached the front doors, threw them open, and didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street. The next day, I returned to work, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But when I walked into the aisle where I'd seen the figure, a single book lay open on the floor, turned to a page about ghost sightings in libraries. After that, I never stayed late in that library again. Story 6: The Midnight Caller. Last autumn, I moved into a small apartment in an older building downtown. It was the perfect spot, close to my job and affordable. The neighbors mostly kept to themselves, and aside from the occasional creaks and groans of an old building, it was pretty quiet. That was until the phone calls started. One chilly November night, I was lying in bed when my phone rang around midnight. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Figuring it was a wrong number, I ignored it. But a few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, curiosity got the better of me, so I answered. "Hello?" I said, but there was only silence on the other end. After a few seconds, I heard a faint, distorted whisper. "I'm watching you." I froze, a chill running down my spine. I hung up immediately, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling. It had to be a prank, I told myself, but as the nights went on, the calls continued. Each time, it was the same. Silence at first, then that eerie whisper saying something like, "I'm close," or "I'm outside." I reported the calls to the phone company, but they couldn't trace them, saying they came from an unlisted number. I even called the police, but there wasn't much they could do without evidence of a threat. One night, around 2 a.m., my phone rang again. This time, I let it ring out, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. From outside my apartment door, I heard faint tapping, followed by that same whispering voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Let me in." Panicking, I called 911 and stayed on the line, whispering to the operator that someone was outside my door. They assured me officers were on their way, but as I waited, I could hear the tapping growing louder, almost frantic. After what felt like hours, I finally heard the sound of sirens. I opened my door to find the hallway empty. The police searched the building but found no one and no signs of a break-in. They suggested it might have been someone trying to scare me, but I knew that voice. I heard it clearly through the door. The calls stopped after that night, but I still get uneasy whenever my phone rings late at night. I moved out the following spring, and to this day, I still wonder who or what was on the other side of that door. Story 7, The Shadow in the Mirror. Last fall, I was house sitting for a friend who lived in a historic home on the edge of town. The house was over 100 years old, with creaky wooden floors, tall windows, and old, ornate furniture. My friend warned me that the place would be a bit creepy at night, but I figured I'd be fine. After all, it was only for a few days. On the first night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed the bathroom mirror. It was large, framed in old, tarnished brass, and slightly foggy, as if it held a haze that couldn't quite be cleaned away. As I washed up, I thought I saw movement in the mirror, a faint shadow flickering behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. I brushed it off, thinking it was just my imagination. The next night, though, things got stranger. I was brushing my teeth when I saw the shadow again. This time, it seemed clearer, almost as if someone was standing in the reflection just beyond the doorway. My heart started pounding, and I quickly turned around, but again, nothing was there. The bathroom was completely silent, save for the sound of the faucet dripping. By the third night, I was genuinely unsettled. I avoided looking in the mirror as much as possible, but every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of that shadowy figure hovering in the corner, like it was waiting. Late that evening, just before I went to bed, I worked up the nerve to look directly into the mirror, determined to prove to myself that it was nothing. But as I stared into the glass, the shadow took shape. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was a tall, dark figure with hollow, sunken eyes staring back at me. I was frozen, unable to look away, as its hand slowly reached up and pressed against the inside of the mirror, as if trying to break through. I stumbled backward, knocking over a small shelf as I scrambled out of the bathroom and slammed the door shut. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the living room couch, too afraid to sleep or go back upstairs. When my friend returned the next day, I told her everything. She looked at me with wide eyes and admitted that she, too, had seen strange things in that mirror, but had never told anyone, thinking she was imagining it. After that, she had the mirror removed and stored in the attic, and we both agreed it was better left forgotten. To this day, I can still see those hollow eyes whenever I think back to that house. And every time I stand in front of a mirror, I can't help but wonder what's really looking back at me. Story 8, The Basement Footsteps. Last October, I rented a small, cozy house on the edge of town. It was old but charming, with a creaky wooden staircase and a basement that was mostly used for storage. The landlord had warned me that the house was a bit drafty, which I didn't mind. It just added to the character. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. But one chilly evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard faint footsteps coming from below. It sounded like someone was walking around in the basement, shuffling slowly across the floor. I brushed it off as an old house settling and tried to ignore it. A few nights later, the footsteps started again, this time louder and more deliberate. It was as if someone was pacing back and forth. I crept down to the basement door, pressing my ear against it. But the moment I did, the sound stopped. When I finally mustered the courage to open the door and look inside, there was nothing, just boxes and shelves covered in dust. Over the next week, the footsteps grew more frequent. Every night, just around midnight, they would start, slow, steady pacing that seemed to echo through the walls. One night, I even heard a faint tapping, as if someone was trying to get my attention from the other side of the basement door. Finally, I called a friend to stay over, hoping I wasn't just imagining things. That night, the footsteps began right on schedule, and this time my friend heard them too. We decided to go down together to check it out. Armed with a flashlight, we slowly made our way down the stairs. The basement was cold, colder than the rest of the house, and a strange, musty smell hung in the air. As we reached the bottom of the stairs, the footsteps stopped. We looked around but saw nothing unusual, just the same dusty boxes and cobwebbed shelves. But as we turned to head back upstairs, we heard a loud, deliberate stomp directly behind us. We both froze, fear washing over us as we realized there was no one else down there. We raced up the stairs, slammed the basement door, and locked it. That night, we slept in shifts, neither of us willing to risk another encounter with whatever was down there. The next day, I called my landlord and asked if he'd ever heard anything strange in the house. He hesitated before finally admitting that the previous tenants had also complained about the footsteps. Apparently, they left after just a few months, unable to handle the constant disturbances. I moved out soon after, and to this day I can still hear those footsteps in my mind. The sound of someone pacing back and forth, forever trapped in that dark, cold basement. Story 9. The Halloween Visitor. Back in 2017, I was living alone in a small suburban neighborhood. I loved Halloween, so every year I'd decorate the house with pumpkins, cobs, and a skeleton or two on the porch. That year, Halloween night was especially quiet. Most of the kids had finished trick-or-treating by 9 p.m., and by 10, I was ready to turn off the lights and head to bed. Just as I was about to lock up, there was a loud knock on the door. It was strange since it was so late, but I figured maybe a late trick-or-treater had wandered over. I opened the door, expecting to see a kid in a costume, but instead, there was a man standing there, wearing a plain, blank white mask and dressed in all black. "Trick or treat," he whispered, his voice hoarse and muffled behind the mask. I forced a laugh, assuming it was a neighbor pulling a late-night prank. "I'm all out of candy," I said, trying to sound casual. But he just stood there, silent, staring at me through the empty eye holes in the mask. The silence stretched, and an uneasy feeling crept over me. "Well, happy Halloween," I mumbled, and slowly started to close the door. But before I could shut it, his hand shot out, holding the door open. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" he whispered, leaning closer. My heart raced as I pushed against the door. "No," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a moment longer, then slowly released his grip and took a step back. I slammed the door and locked it, quickly turning off all the lights in the house. I peeked out through the window and saw him standing there on the sidewalk, looking up at my house, his mask barely visible in the glow of the streetlight. He didn't move, just stood there, staring. After a few minutes, he finally walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I waited a while before turning the lights back on, still shaken by the encounter. The next morning, I found a note on my doorstep. It was scrawled in shaky handwriting and read, "See you next Halloween." I never saw him again, but every Halloween since, I find myself double-checking the locks, hoping that masked figure won't return. Story 10. The Figure at the Cabin. Last fall, I rented a small cabin in the mountains for a weekend getaway. I'd been feeling stressed and needed some time away, so I booked a remote spot surrounded by thick woods, hoping for a peaceful escape. The first night was quiet. I spent the evening by the fireplace, reading and listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The cabin was old but cozy, and I quickly settled in, feeling grateful for the solitude. On the second night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a faint knock on the cabin door. It was strange. There was no one around for miles, and I hadn't seen a single car or person on my way up. Cautiously, I approached the door and peered out through the small window, but all I could see was darkness and trees. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just a branch hitting the door in the wind. But just as I turned away, the knocking started again, louder this time. My heart pounded as I slowly opened the door, looking out into the night. There was no one there, just the still, quiet woods and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. I shut the door, locking it behind me, and went back inside. But as I sat back down, I caught sight of something through the window. A figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and thin, and it seemed to be watching the cabin. I froze, staring at it, trying to make out any features, but it was too dark. After a few moments, the figure stepped back into the shadows, disappearing among the trees. I barely slept that night, every sound and creak of the cabin setting me on edge. The next morning, I packed up and left as soon as the sun rose, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin one last time, and there, standing just outside the door, was the same figure watching me leave. I never went back to that cabin, and to this day, I still get chills thinking about the silent figure waiting just beyond the trees, hidden in the shadows. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. If these tales of darkness left you with a lingering chill, remember to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more whispers from the shadows. Until next time, stay safe and watch the shadows carefully. You never know what might be lurking. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. If these tales of darkness left you with a lingering chill, remember to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more whispers from the shadows. Until next time, stay safe and watch the shadows carefully. You never know what might be lurking.